Since the Prince Regent first visited in the 18th century and built his extraordinary royal palace here, Brighton has been a fashionable destination for visitors. Being the nearest spot on the south coast to central London, the Regency Resort quickly became popular with holidaymakers and day trippers. Brighton now attracts 8 million visitors a year. It has become one of Britain's top 10 destinations for overseas visitors and a popular place for short stays, city breaks and cultural visits. Brighton unusually has 2 piers. One, a thriving mixture of fairground rides, amusement arcades and bars, and the other, a fading relic from a grand old past. Since its opening in 1866, the pier has become one of Brighton's most talked about tourist attractions.
Well, the pier was built between 1863 and 1866. That was at a time when there was no railway station which came directly to the seashore, so as far as we can make out, the whole of the construction was done by pure manpower, assisted by a few horses and a bit of steam.
Well, as people got used to the idea of promenading, then they wanted more activity. So this building, which is the pavilion that we're in, was put up in 1891, 24 years after the birth of the pier. It was originally used as a theatre, but then became much more of an arts centre. I mean, the piers at that time, the 1890s, early Edwardian days, were really what we now call arts centres.
Sadly, since the pier's closure in September 1975 and its subsequent fall into the sea, discussion has turned to its future and whether to save or demolish this ageing structure. In its dilapidated state, surviving the elements from year to year is becoming increasingly more difficult.
The sort of decline of the West Pier really began with the Second World War, when it was closed. It reopened in 1949, and from that moment onwards it never really was properly maintained. So it entered a slow period of decline, with it just getting more and more unsafe. Also, though, the owners of the pier didn't manage to keep abreast of the changing fashions in leisure activity, so it became old-fashioned, a bit tawdry, just not a very popular, fashionable place to go anymore. Well, the West Pier at its peak was, which I would take to be the 1920s, would have been very, very busy, both sort of commercially, in terms of shops and entertainments, and culturally. I mean, there was a very busy and successful theatre at the end, but also, of course, there's lots of other sorts of entertainment and shops, and just promenading, and people like to promenade and sit and look at the sea and the panorama and people watch. There's a complete range of drama in the theatre, from sort of highbrow Shakespeare to sort of pantomime, and it was sort of the hub of Brighton social life.
The stormy weather, which often hits the south coast, has taken its toll on many seaside towns. Numerous seafront structures have been damaged or destroyed by the raging sea, and in such tempestuous conditions, the West Pier is no different. Much of the pier's original buildings and ornate architecture have disappeared. But only from the eyes of the land-bound observer. However, these decorative artifacts have not been lost, merely fallen to another resting place. Now lying on the seabed, the cast iron scrollwork looks even more elegant, covered in green, red and brown seaweed flowing in the current. Sea anemones of many colours cling to the scrolls. As part of the pier's restoration, divers have been called in to work under the pier to reinforce this dangerous structure. Their task is to repair the foundations on which the West Pier rests and to salvage fallen artefacts. But these very items pose a dangerous threat to the men trying to rescue them from the seabed.
The main dangers under here are obviously the lack of visibility. It's very close inshore, it's pretty shallow work, you don't get much visibility, and of course the area is covered with very sharp, old, rusty steel. You can get cut, because you can't actually see where you're going, you're walking along the seabed, you can actually pin yourself to a piece of rusty steel that's actually just sticking jaggedly out of the seabed.
The threat of laceration or impalement on the razor-sharp debris is always a risk in the poor or sometimes complete lack of visibility, slowing progress even further. In addition, the risk of being crushed by fallen debris from above is ever present. When submerged, the divers are slow and cumbersome, tethered to the surface vessel by up to 100 metres of umbilical, which provides the divers with air to breathe and a means of communication with the surface.
The air is fed to the diver by a hose, which we call an umbilical. That's fed into the diving hat, and it's very safe. You have an air supply, which is low pressure air, which is fed to you all the time. You've got high pressure backups, and you've also got a bailout cylinder, which you wear on your back. In case everything else fails, you can breathe off that until you're rescued. Everything is planned on safety. Diving isn't hard to do. It's what you actually do at the end of it is the hard work. Whether you're manually working underwater with a sledgehammer or doing inspection work, that is the work. Diving is just a way of getting to the job.
Please don't fill up the water.
Commercial divers have been used to maintain the pier throughout its life.
Most jobs, you're actually weighted to keep you on the seabed. I mean, if you can imagine, if you were too buoyant in the water, you couldn't actually work because you'd be lifted up and down by the tide. So you wear a weighted jacket and you wear weighted boots, and the equipment is heavy anyway. So it actually keeps you firmly secured to the seabed. So you actually walk to the job. So the diver's now got his head inside this hat. The neck dam is on his neck. These levers are pulled out. We call this the toilet pad in the game. And this fits snugly up inside like so. Clips over the top. Safety levers goes in like so. And the diver's head is now securely locked inside the hat. This is the bailout bottle. It's held securely in this jacket. This is the jacket that we actually wear underwater. It's made of very heavy duty nylon with webbing straps. The straps do up across your chest. You get two jock straps which come up underneath and tighten up on the front. Obviously you've got your D-rings as well, which is for security. That keeps it snugly against the diver so it doesn't rattle around on him when he's actually working underwater. It's just like wearing a heavy rucksack. You wear a heavy rucksack, it's heavy on your back. But of course the water is supporting you as well, so there's a sort of happy medium between not being too light, but being heavy enough to actually just keep you on the seabed.
Modern diving technology has made this dangerous task a lot safer to perform than in the early days of diving.
Well, the diving team in those days was only just one diver. It was in the very early stages. I mean, now it's a four-man team. But the days that I worked there, it was just your one diver, your qualified linesman, and a pumping party. I worked mainly on the West Pier during the 1960s. I did eventually finish working on the West Pier in the very early 1970s. All we used to dive for was with a single cylinder. You just watched your gauge, and when you went on to reserve, you just came up. No standby divers in those days. You just had to rely on good luck. It screws on with a quarter of a turn, and you line up the valve with the top left hand nut, and that screws on, and then what happens is the little recess drops, little stud drops into that recess, and that prevents the helmet from being unscrewed while the diver's working on the bottom. I qualified as a diver with the Royal Navy at Gillingham Pier, which was the Navy diving school for Chatham. I became a third-class diver, and then later on I re-qualified second, and eventually I worked up to a first-class diver, and I left the Navy in 1953. My last ship was HMS Belfast, the one up in London, and I was chief diver aboard there for the Korean War. And during the course of that I had several jobs to do with the Korean Navy, and eventually I was mentioned in dispatches for diving work, getting a body out of a crashed aircraft, and also working with the Korean Navy for various jobs that we had to be done. It's so comfortable. I consider it, with all the modern equipment, you can't beat the old-fashioned helmet gear for comfort. It is heavy. I mean, the helmet weighs 56 pounds, the boots weigh 18 pounds each. You have a front and back weight which weighs 40 pounds. So a fully dressed standard diver, without his own body weight, while he's on the surface, and once he comes up and his helmet breaks surface, he's carrying on his shoulders 186 pounds worth of weight.
They obviously had a more dangerous job to do because they were at the sort of forefront of the technology. They only had one air hose to the hat, they never had any bailout, they never had any backup. If the pump on the surface that was supplying them air broke, they didn't have any air. All they had was the air left in their diving dress that they were wearing, and depending on what depth they were, that would last only up to about 8 minutes.
Take it off as well.
Oh right, good, yes. With this gear, when you were working, you used to go down for at least 1-2 hours, depending on the work. I could stay down quite comfortably for 8 hours without having to surface.
In its heyday, hordes of people could safely visit the West Pier, but at the moment it can only be viewed from the shore. Thousands of people swim and paddle in the sea around the West Pier throughout the year. But due to the pier's decayed and consequent unstable condition, a 75-metre exclusion zone has been introduced around the structure, thus preventing anyone in the water from viewing the expanse of wildlife thriving beneath. A privileged few have seen the hidden reef below the pier, mostly the commercial divers who, for their living, have to penetrate this exclusion zone.
Since I was about 5 years old, I used to always be in the water at the West Pier, in the paddling pool down there. So I was always in there. I learned to snorkel there. My grandparents and my parents used to take me there. I've always been interested in diving, and I always used to watch Jacques Cousteau programmes, Hans and Lottie Haas, and Ron and Valerie Taylor, the shot in particular. I used to watch them. Always wanted to do it since I was really small. I used to practice breast holding when I was really young, and then just always had an interest. Always in the sea, swimming, that sort of thing. The first time I went down there, it was a case of not really knowing what to expect. I went with a a very experienced sports diver, and he took me down and basically taught me the ropes, really. The thing you realise the more you dive and the more you look at what you're diving is that every single inch of the seabed is covered in marine life. Every inch of it. People think that underneath the pier is a barren wasteland. There's nothing there, no sea life, no marine life, and it's just a big black mess with nothing. It's just a big, like space, if you like, void, nothing there, no life at all. And they're wrong, basically.
It's teeming with wildlife. I mean, there's so many crabs. You get lobsters here. You get sea anemones, fish. You know, there's just so much, and there's so much life living on the piles themselves as well. Marine growth is just prolific down there.
We used to see congers and crabs and all, various other fish. It was quite an interesting dive every time you went down there, because you never knew what you were going to meet.
You're amazed by what's down there and how pretty it is. I mean, the thing is, it changes so much down there. I mean, some days you can't see your hand in front of your face, and other days you'll see a good 10-15 metres underwater, you know, straight ahead of you horizontally. And the actual feelings you get are you just think, wow, this is amazing. Especially when you're on the bottom of the seabed, you're hovering there in midair as if you're flying, and you look up and you see the sun glinting through the water, and the water's like a green colour sort of thing, and you just think it's amazing. It's just amazing, really. Forms like an artificial reef. What it does is it provides shelter from predators, it provides a home for them to produce their young, and generally a feeding ground as well. You get the weed, the molluscs, the barnacles, the mussels, all growing on the piles, on the debris, on the wreckage, and it provides, you know, a complete marine habitat really for various species.
Crabs start their lives as plankton and undergo 6 changes of form before evolving as tiny crabs. The crab has an exoskeleton, a skeleton which grows outside the body. A crab grows by periodically molting its shell. Lost legs or claws can be regrown. The velvet swimming crab has red eyes and an aggressive nature to match. Flattened, paddle-like back legs aid with swimming. Sand sticks to the soft velvety hairs on its back for camouflage. The spiny spider crab has long legs, very small pincers, and walks forward, all adding to a spider-like appearance. This crab camouflages itself by lodging shells and weeds onto its spiny carapace. In spite of its plant-like appearance, the anemone is in fact a living creature. Various types of anemones are found under the West Pier. Plumose anemones, so called because of their feathery tentacles, green and red strawberry beadlet anemones, and the snake look an enemy. Spending their lives firmly attached to rocks and fallen debris, and enemies use thousands of tiny stinging cells to paralyze unwary prey. Eels love the dark holes and crevices under the pier. Females produce up to 8 million eggs. Tiny transparent larvae then take 1 or 2 years to develop into small eels. These small eels then drift back to the feeding ground of their parents, the West Pier. Many types of wrasse are found living under the pier, nestled amongst the fallen beams and girders. The cuttlefish are masters of disguise, changing colour to blend in with the surroundings. They are thought to communicate with each other by pulsing colour all over their bodies. They can use more dramatic colour changes to confuse both prey and predators, including black, false eye spots on their back, and even changing their skin texture from smooth to spiky. Using jet propulsion, the cuttlefish can swiftly escape danger by forcing water through 2 funnels formed by their modified foot. Cuttlefish bones and grape-like cuttle-egg masses are familiar sights on Brighton's beaches. Starfish are found on mussel beds under the pier. Their main predators being other types of starfish, they also eat bivalves, such as mussels, which are more than plentiful under the pier. Thousands of tiny tubed feet on the underside of starfish are used for mobility. Often they will be equipped with powerful suckers for gripping onto rocks and pulling shellfish apart. Providing its mouth and stomach are attached, the starfish can regrow itself from just one ray.
To the naked eye, it does look very derelict when you first come on here. But in fact, especially the experience we've had over the last few years, we've found that a lot of the cast iron is still, once it's cleaned down, it's still usable. So it's much more a restoration and replacement than a replication project.
The interesting thing about the West Pier, and a very important factor why it's such an important pier, is that it wasn't built on beyond 1916, unlike just about every other pier that's ever been built, which is that they've evolved. And that is actually what happens to piers; they evolve with time, because that their life expectancy, or the life expectancy of the individual buildings, is never that long.
The architectural interest in the debris is basically, if you imagine the pier, or if you've been on the pier when it was in working order, all of that scroll work, the cast iron columns, the snake lanterns, all of the fixtures and fittings that were Victorian, very decorative. Where the piers collapsed, they're now on the seabed. So some of that debris on the seabed has got great architectural interest. Okay, it's gone from the pier, but it's not gone. It's just in a different place. It's just been moved.
Because the pier is like is an abandoned building, a bit like a shipwreck. I know there's a lot of wildlife under there that wouldn't normally be there had it not, if it was active. And there's obviously an issue about, an ecological issue about not disturbing that as little as possible.
fate of the West Pier is closely linked with its underwater inhabitants. The death of the pier and its subsequent collapse has given life to the undersea world. Created by decay, the ruins of Brighton's Victorian pier have provided these enchanting creatures with a man-made, yet ideal habitat. But fallen debris in which these creatures exist today may be removed, and the bustling community of underwater life may have to find another place to live. But until that day, this complex society of intelligent and colourful water creatures will continue to inhabit what from the land seems like a desolate and perilous place.